In this video, we will quickly describe some guidelines or good programming practices that you should consider adopting while writing code. Everyone who writes code has a set of personal preferences on how to organize their functions, their files, data, even how to name those functions, files, and so forth. Some of these preferences make it easier for others to use and understand their code, and some do not. It's impossible to find a single set of rules or guidelines that will appeal to all those writing code. And in most cases, a group, company, or institution will actually define some set of rules for their members or employees to follow so that any code that's generated should be more quickly understood and used by others in the same group. Python is one of the few languages that has attempted to adopt a sort of universal style or set of guidelines and rules for their coders to use when creating code for the community. You can find this style guide in PEP 8, where PEP stands for Python Enhancement Proposal, and I've given you a link to the document here in the text. The Python Enhancement Proposals are documents that describe proposed changes and improvements to Python. You can actually read more about what PEP are in PEP number 1, which actually describes the purpose and guidelines for all other enhancement proposals. Enhancement proposals start with an idea, which is submitted via a PEP, and each proposal is reviewed by the steering council and the core developers who decide on whether that proposal will be accepted and if any changes will be made to subsequent versions of Python. Now, as I said, PEP 8 describes Python's style guide, which was accepted and is widely followed. If you follow this guide, you can not only make your code more easily read and understood by other developers, but you can also help yourself to reduce the number of common mistakes that are made while coding. So I'm not going to go through this document, but you can see from the table of contents here that it covers code layout, use of white space, comments, naming conventions, and several other areas. Also, I've listed a few items that you may wish to consider back here in the notes. The first of which is you may wish to consider adopting for-space indentation. When you write the body of an if statement, for instance, or a function, or any place where Python requires some indentation, it's recommended that you use for spaces and not tabs. Also, it can be helpful if you limit each line of code to fewer than 79 characters. If you have to scroll way over to the right to finish reading a line of code, it can make things more difficult to understand and potentially allow for mistakes or bugs to enter your program. Also, if your editor supports line wrapping, then indentation can be difficult to see and again make things more difficult to understand and or debug. Using blank lines to provide visual boundaries between functions, classes, or any large blocks of code can also be very useful for those reading your code, since it helps them to see where blocks begin and end. Writing useful and concise comments is never a bad thing, and it's recommended that they appear on their own line rather than interspersed with other code. Use of doc strings to help document your classes and functions and so forth is also highly recommended and appreciated by those trying to use your code. Use of spaces around operators and after commas can make code more readable. Also, not using spaces inside braces can save space on long lines without sacrificing readability. Consistent and descriptive, yet concise, names for variables, functions, classes, modules, etc. should be used everywhere. Also, the convention is to use camel case for classes. That is, the names of classes should not contain underscores, and the first character of every new word should be capitalized with all other characters lowercase. For functions, methods, and variable names, these should all be lowercase with words separated by underscores. Also, don't use non-ASCII characters in any names. Try to use plain ASCII as much as possible. So this list is just a sample of what's contained in PEP 8. And again, I'm not going to cover everything in there and certainly could not do so in just a couple minutes. But it's definitely worth your time to preview this document. And I would encourage you to incorporate as much of this as possible into your code.